The cold in Boise on that Christmas Eve was a living, breathing entity. It didn't just chill the skin, it seeped into the marrow of your bones, a dry, crystalline freeze that stole the very breath from your lungs. My heavy, winter-grade boots, scarred from years on the dojang mats, crunched through the pristine, thick layer of snow blanketing the walkway to my daughter's house. Each step was an effort, the snow grasping at my ankles like a desperate hand. The wind, sharp and unforgiving, sliced through the air and slapped my face, a stinging reminder of the world's harshness. I tugged the collar of my wool coat higher, the coarse fabric a familiar comfort against my cheek. After a lifetime in Taekwondo, first as a competitor, then as a coach for the national team, I thought I was inured to extremes. I'd trained in the sweltering, sweat-soaked heat of summer dojos and pushed through the biting chill of winter training camps. But this cold was different. It was a profound, isolating emptiness that settled in the silent spaces between the falling snowflakes. I stood there for a long moment, just beyond the halo of warm, golden light spilling from the large picture window of the house. A nervous excitement fluttered in my chest, a stark contrast to the external freeze. I was here to surprise Emily. My little girl. I'd flown in straight from a week-long coaching stint in Seattle, the adrenaline of the tournament still a faint hum in my veins. I could almost picture her face, the wide, cornflower blue eyes, the shock of delight, the radiant smile that had been the sun of my universe ever since the nurse placed her in my arms 30 years ago. The house, a modern 2-story structure in the upscale Meadow Creek neighborhood, was picture-perfect. A fresh blanket of snow coated the roof and clung to the eaves. Through the expansive window, I could see the scene inside, a living Christmas card. A massive tree, twinkling with 1,000 white lights, stood proudly in one corner, its branches heavy with ornate decorations. A long dining table, draped in a rich crimson cloth, groaned under the weight of a festive feast. A golden brown roasted turkey, steam still rising from its skin in faint wisps, a crystal bowl of cranberry salad glistening with ruby red jewels, and a battalion of wine glasses catching the firelight, each one a tiny, dancing star. And there they were. The Whitlock family, in all their glory. My son-in-law, Ryan, stood near the head of the table, holding a glass of champagne, his face animated as he told a story. His father, Harold, a man whose very posture screamed of a lifetime on the bench, sat with an air of unshakable authority, a slight, condescending smile playing on his lips. His mother, Evelyn, was the picture of elegant complacency, her wine glass held aloft, her smile as polished and cold as the diamonds at her ears. Ryan's sister, Abigail, was there too, her 2 young children chasing each other around the table, their high-pitched laughter a faint, tinny sound through the double-paned glass. But where was Emily? A frown creased my forehead. I scanned the room again, my eyes darting from corner to corner, expecting to see her emerge from the kitchen with a platter of food or sitting quietly on the sofa. I had imagined her here, in the heart of it all, her smile bright, her presence a calming balm. I remembered how she used to wrap her arms around my neck during the holidays, her voice a happy torrent of stories and secrets. The mental image was so vivid, so warm, that the cold around me seemed to intensify in contrast. Then I heard it. A sound so faint it was almost swallowed by the wind. A whimper. It came from the porch. I turned, my heart lurching into a frantic, irregular rhythm. There, Tucked into a shadowy corner next to a snow-burdened poinsettia planter, was an old wooden rocking chair. And curled within it, a figure so small and still she seemed like a part of the winter landscape. Emily? The name was a whisper, a prayer, a denial. I moved without thought, my body propelled by a surge of primal fear. My boots slipped on the icy porch steps, but I barely registered it. In 3 long strides, I was at her side. My daughter was shivering, her entire body convulsing in a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She wore only a thin, floral print blouse, the fabric soaked through in places from the melted snow that dripped from the roof. Her jeans were dark with dampness. No coat. No blanket. Her hair, usually so shiny and well-kept, was a tangled mess, plastered to her forehead and pale cheeks. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, a futile attempt to generate warmth. Emily. I cried out, my voice cracking with a panic I had never known. I shrugged out of my thick, padded coaching jacket, my fingers fumbling with the zipper in my haste. I wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling the material tight, trying to cocoon her in whatever warmth I could offer. My trembling hands brushed against her arm. It was ice cold. Not just cold, but a deep, alarming cold that felt lifeless. She lifted her face slowly, as if the movement took immense effort. Her eyes, those beautiful blue eyes, were red-rimmed and hollow, devoid of their usual light. Her lips, pale and chapped, parted. Mom? The word was a ghost of a sound, so faint it was almost carried away on the wind. Then her eyes rolled back, and she slumped forward, collapsing against my shoulder. I caught her, my arms tightening around her frail frame. She felt so light, so fragile, like a bird with broken wings. Her body shook against mine, a constant, terrifying tremor. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here, I whispered into her hair, my voice thick with tears I refused to shed. Now was not the time for my weakness. I had to be her strength. Frantically, I unzipped my suitcase, yanking out a thick, cable-knit sweater I'd packed. I pulled it over her head, maneuvering her limp arms through the sleeves. Her skin was like marble. I rubbed her hands between mine, trying to stimulate circulation, my own breath puffing out in frantic white clouds. From inside the house, the laughter continued, loud and carefree. I clearly heard Ryan's voice, deep and smug, boasting about a recent case win. The sound was followed by a chorus of laughter and the cheerful, melodic clinking of glasses. They were toasting. They were warm. They were happy. While my daughter froze to death on their porch. A rage, cold and sharp, began to crystallize within me, cutting through the panic. It was a clean, focused anger I recognized from the ring, the kind that came when an opponent crossed a line. I had to get her out of here. Now. I slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she were a child. Her soaked slippers fell into the snow with 2 soft, pathetic thuds. I held her close, her head lolling against my neck, her faint, shallow breaths a whisper against my skin. I took a step toward the path, toward the taxi I'd asked to wait at the end of the street. But then I stopped. My eyes were drawn back to the brightly lit window, to the scene of opulent warmth and cruel indifference. No. They would not get away with this. They would see what they had done. I turned, my daughter held securely in my arms, and walked toward the front door. Each step was deliberate, heavy with purpose. The laughter from inside was a soundtrack to my mounting fury. I didn't knock. I shifted Emily's weight, braced myself, and kicked. The sole of my boot connected with the wood just beside the lock. It wasn't a wild, frantic kick, it was a practiced, powerful tukgong strike, channeling a lifetime of discipline and strength. The door flew inward with a splintering crack, slamming against the wall with a force that shook the very frame. The Christmas music, a tinny Bluetooth rendition of Jingle Bells, cut off abruptly. The laughter died in their throats. Every head in the room swiveled towards me. I stood in the shattered doorway, a silhouette against the winter night, my daughter cradled in my arms like a fallen angel. Snow swirled around us, eddying into the warm, fragrant air of the house. Evelyn Whitlock was the first to recover. She stood, her wine glass sloshing crimson onto the pristine white rug. Her face was a mask of startled indignation. "Rose, what is the meaning of this?" I ignored her. My gaze swept the room, taking in Harold's cold, calculating stare, Ryan's shocked arrogance, Abigail's disdainful curl of the lip. I met each of their eyes, letting them see the storm in mine. Then, my voice low, steady, and cutting through the silence like a blade, I spoke the 6 words that would change everything. I am taking my daughter home. The taxi ride to my small apartment near the National Training Center was a blur of streetlights and silent tears. Emily lay across the back seat, her head in my lap, still shivering, though the violent tremors had subsided into a constant, fine quiver. I stroked her hair, humming an old lullaby, the same one I'd sung to her when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. The driver, a kind-eyed man with a thick accent, had glanced in the rearview mirror once, seen my face, and wisely remained silent. My mind, however, was a whirlwind, tearing through the events of the last few hours, searching for clues I had missed, for signs of the rot that had festered in my daughter's life. Just a few hours ago, I had been at the Boise airport, still buzzing from the energy of the national team trials. The air there had been thick with the smell of jet fuel and anticipation. I dragged my old, trusty suitcase, the one with tags from Seoul, Los Angeles, and now Seattle, through the bustling terminal, my heart light with a giddy excitement. I was going to see my girl. I remembered pulling out my phone in the waiting area, my thumb hovering over Emily's contact photo, a picture of her laughing, her head thrown back, sunlight catching the gold in her hair. I'd wanted to hear her voice, to confirm she was home, to bask in the secret knowledge of my surprise. The phone had rung. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Emily. Sorry I missed you." Her cheerful, recorded voice was a stark contrast to the silence that followed. A knot of unease had tightened in my chest. I'd pushed it down. She's busy, I told myself. She's probably up to her elbows in flour, making her famous pumpkin pie, or decorating the tree, meticulously placing each ornament as she always did. I'd send a text. "Mom's on her way. You home?" I'd stared at the screen, waiting for the telltale dots to appear. Nothing. The message remained unread, a tiny, digital sentinel of my growing anxiety. The plane had landed in Boise after dark. Stepping out of the climate-controlled cabin was like walking into a wall of ice. I'd pulled my coat tighter, watching families reunite with hugs and laughter, their breath mingling in the frosty air. A father had hoisted his little girl onto his shoulders, her mittened hand clutching a candy cane. She'd giggled, a sound of pure joy, and a lump had formed in my throat. I remembered carrying Emily like that, her small hands tangled in my hair, her laughter my personal symphony. Now, I was just a woman alone, dragging a heavy suitcase through the slush, a profound loneliness wrapping around me as tightly as my scarf. I'd flagged a taxi. Meadow Creek, 12th Street, I'd said, my voice hoarse from disuse and exhaustion. The drive had been slow, the streets clogged with last-minute shoppers and families heading to midnight mass. Through the taxi window, I'd watched the world go by, a diorama of warm, lit windows, each one a promise of family and fellowship. The distant, melodic peal of church bells mixed with a choir singing, Silent Night, from a nearby cathedral. I'd smiled then, a fragile, hopeful thing. I'd pictured Emily in her kitchen, humming along, preparing the garlic mashed potatoes she'd learned from me, the recipe passed down from my own mother. Then, at a red light, I'd seen him. A tall, broad-shouldered figure in a police uniform, directing traffic with an easy confidence. Even from a distance, I recognized the posture, the straight back, the balanced stance of a martial artist. "Jake," I'd whispered, then rolled down the window. "Jake." He'd turned, his face breaking into a wide, familiar grin when he saw me. "Ms. Rose. You're back." He jogged over to the cab, adjusting his police cap. "Just finished up in Seattle," I'd said, smiling back. "I see you're keeping the streets of Boise safe." "Trying my best," he'd replied, his breath pluming in the cold. "You here for Christmas? With Emily?" The mention of her name had made my heart swell. Yes. Surprising her. But then, something had shifted. Jake's smile had faltered. A shadow had passed behind his eyes, a flicker of something, worry? Pity, so quick I almost missed it. Almost. My instincts, honed from years of reading opponents, had gone on high alert. "What's wrong, Jake? Is something up?" He'd shaken his head, the forced smile returning, but it didn't reach his eyes. No, it's nothing, Ms. Rose. Just, glad you're back." It was a lie. A polite, well-intentioned lie, but a lie nonetheless. The light had turned green, and the taxi had pulled away, leaving Jake standing on the curb, his hand gripping the brim of his cap, his gaze following me with a disquieting intensity. That moment in the taxi now felt like a premonition. Jake had known. Or at least, he'd suspected. The knot in my chest tightened into a hard, cold ball of dread. Back in the present, the taxi pulled up to my apartment building. It was modest, a stark contrast to the Whitlocks' grand home, but it was mine. It was safe. "Wait here, please," I told the driver, my voice firm. I carefully extracted myself from under Emily, propping her against the seat, and ran inside to get my keys. In minutes, I had her upstairs, laid gently on her old bed in the room I always kept ready for her. I piled blankets on top of her, then went to the kitchen to boil water for tea. As I waited for the kettle to whistle, I leaned against the counter, my body trembling with delayed shock and fury. The image of Emily on that porch was seared into my mind. But it was the sounds that truly haunted me, the careless laughter, the clinking glasses, and the words I had heard just before I found her, words that now echoed with terrifying clarity. I had been standing at the door, my hand raised to knock, ready to deliver my happy surprise. But the mocking laugh from inside had frozen me in place. It was Harold Whitlock's voice, deep and gruff, dripping with contempt. That's what they call a daughter-in-law. A woman who can't even have kids. For miscarriages. Haven't they embarrassed us enough? Then Ryan's voice, cold and cruel, the voice of the man who had vowed to love and cherish my daughter. She's always faking depression, locking herself in her room. If it weren't for my parents, I'd have kicked her out ages ago. Another laugh, this one higher, more venomous. Abigail. Yeah, totally useless. A wife who can't have kids. What's she good for? Pretending to be sick just to get coddled. Pathetic. Each word had been a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs. I had stood there, paralyzed, my hands still hovering in the air, as their cruel chorus painted a picture of my daughter's hell. For miscarriages. Each one had been a phone call filled with heart-wrenching sobs, a piece of her soul fracturing and dying. I had listened, helpless from miles away, my own heart breaking with hers. And they called it faking. They called her useless. The kettle's shrill whistle jerked me back to the present. I poured the steaming water into a mug, my hands shaking so badly I sloshed it onto the counter. They had thrown her out into the cold. My Emily. My light. I carried the tea into her room. She was asleep, but her brow was furrowed, her eyelids fluttering with bad dreams. I set the mug down and sank into the chair beside her bed, taking her cold hand in mine. The fight was over. For tonight, at least. She was safe. But as I watched her sleep, the storm inside me began to gather, quiet and deadly. The Whitlocks had made a grave mistake. They hadn't just hurt my daughter. They had declared war on her mother. The next few days passed in a hazy, painful blur. Emily slept for nearly 16 hours straight, a deep, exhausted slumber from which she would occasionally stir, murmuring incoherently before sinking back under. I barely left her side, catching only fitful naps in the chair, my body taut as a bowstring, listening to every hitch in her breath. When she finally woke, it was to a crushing silence. She would sit by the window in the living room, wrapped in the afghan my mother had knitted, and stare out at the gray Boise sky. The vibrant, talkative woman I knew was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell. Her eyes, when they met mine, were pools of a shame and despair so profound it stole my breath. "Emily, sweetheart," I said gently on the second morning, placing a plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the coffee table in front of her. "You need to eat." She looked at the food as if it were a foreign object, then shook her head slowly, her gaze returning to the window. "I'm not hungry, Mom." Her voice was a monotone, stripped of all inflection. It was the voice of someone who had given up. Later that day, I called Dr. Linda Carter, a therapist in downtown Boise who specialized in trauma and grief. Getting Emily there was a battle in itself. She resisted, whispering that she was fine, that she didn't want to be a bother. It was only when I framed it as doing it for me, to ease my worry, that she relented. Dr. Carter's office was a sanctuary of soft lights and warm colors, a stark contrast to the cold, hard reality we faced. I waited in the reception area, my knee bouncing nervously, for what felt like an eternity. When the door finally opened, Emily emerged looking even more drained. Dr. Carter gestured for me to come in. "Ms. Rose," she began, her kind eyes filled with a professional sorrow. "Emily is suffering from severe clinical depression, compounded by complex post-traumatic stress. The repeated pregnancy losses are a profound trauma on their own. But the constant psychological abuse from her in-laws, the invalidation of her grief, the name-calling, it has systematically destroyed her sense of self-worth." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "She believes what they say about her. That she is useless. A failure." I closed my eyes, the pain a sharp, physical thing in my chest. What can I do? Keep her safe. That is the first and most important thing. She needs stability, unconditional love, and professional support. She's on a very fragile ledge right now. Her treatment will be a long road. I left the office with a prescription for antidepressants and a heart heavier than lead. I had failed her. I had been so focused on my career, on building a legacy in the sport I loved, that I had missed the signs of her life falling apart. The expensive gifts, the long-distance calls, they were a poor substitute for being present. When we returned to the apartment, Jake was waiting for us, leaning against his personal car, a simple sedan. He was out of uniform, wearing jeans and a heavy jacket. In his hands was a small, brown paper bag. "Ms. Rose," he said, straightening up. His eyes immediately found Emily, and his expression softened with a concern that felt genuine. "Emily." Emily flinched slightly, avoiding his gaze, her shoulders hunching as if to make herself smaller. I brought you this," Jake said, holding out the bag. He looked uncharacteristically nervous. "They're my mom's old cookbooks. She swore by them. I thought, maybe when you're feeling up to it, you might like to look through them." It was a clumsy, heartfelt gesture. Cooking had been Emily's passion, her creative outlet. She had once dreamed of opening a small bakery. Emily took the bag without looking inside. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I don't think I can. I don't think I can do anything anymore." The defeat in her tone was a knife to the heart. Jake's face fell for a moment, but he recovered quickly, nodding with understanding. "That's okay. No pressure. Just, they're here if you want them." He turned to me. "Anything you need, Ms. Rose. Just say the word." "I need a lawyer, Jake. A good one. One who isn't afraid of the Whitlocks." He nodded grimly. "I know a guy. James Miller. He's tough, and he hates bullies. I'll give him a call." That night, after Emily was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table, the dim overhead light creating a small pool of illumination in the dark apartment. I spread out a decade's worth of bank statements, printed copies of text messages, and the few emails Emily had sent me over the years. I was building a case, not just for a court of law, but for my own sanity. I needed to see the proof that I had tried, that I had been there in the only ways I knew how. The paper trail was a painful narrative of its own. Large sums of money transferred to Emily's joint account with Ryan, for a new sofa, for holiday expenses, for medical bills. I remembered our calls. Mom, Ryan thinks we need to upgrade the living room set to match the new house. Mom, the Whitlocks are hosting Christmas this year, and Evelyn says it has to be perfect. I had sent the money, always with a note. For you, my love. Buy something beautiful. I never imagined it was being siphoned into their lavish lifestyle, while my daughter was being emotionally bled dry. A soft noise made me look up. Emily was standing in the doorway of her room, her silhouette frail in the darkness. Mom? Her voice was thick with sleep and fear. What are you doing? Just some paperwork, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. She padded into the kitchen, her eyes widening as she saw the documents spread across the table. Is this about me? About them? I'm not going to let them get away with this, Emily. Tears welled in her eyes. Please, Mom. Don't. It will only make it worse. They're too powerful. Harold knows everyone. They'll destroy you. I stood and went to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. She felt so small, so breakable. Let them try, I whispered into her hair, my voice steady despite the fear coiling in my own gut. From now on, I'm the one who protects you. I promise. I led her back to bed, tucking the blankets around her as if she were 5 years old again. When her breathing evened out into sleep, I returned to the kitchen. The resolve inside me had hardened into something unyielding. It was then that I heard a faint rustling outside my apartment door. I froze, listening. A soft thud, then the sound of retreating footsteps, quick and light, on the concrete stairs. I waited a full minute, my senses on high alert, before I slowly, quietly, approached the door. I didn't open it immediately. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Taking a deep breath, I unchained the door and opened it a crack. Lying on the worn welcome mat was a thick, cream-colored envelope. There was no name, no address. I picked it up, my fingers trembling with a fresh wave of anger. I carried it back to the kitchen table and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of high-quality bond paper. The message was typed, the letters stark and black against the white background. Don't mess with the Whitlock family if you don't want to end up as miserable as your daughter. Give up. I stared at the words, my blood running cold. It wasn't just the threat itself, it was the casual cruelty of it, the absolute certainty that they could intimidate me into silence. They thought I was a useless old woman, just like they thought Emily was a useless wife. They were wrong. I crumpled the note in my fist, the paper crackling in the silent apartment. The fear I felt was instantly incinerated by a white-hot rage. This wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war. And I was ready to fight. The meeting with James Miller took place in his downtown office, a no-frills space that smelled of old books and strong coffee. He was a man in his late 50s, with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that missed nothing. Jake sat with me, a solid, reassuring presence. I laid it all out. The financial records, the therapist's initial assessment, the whispered conversation I'd overheard, the scene on the porch, and finally, the anonymous threat. James listened intently, steepling his fingers under his chin. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "The Whitlocks," he said, shaking his head. "Harold retired from the bench, but he still plays golf with half the judiciary. Evelyn's family money built the new wing of the art museum. They're entrenched, Ms. Rose. This won't be a fair fight." "I'm not asking for a fair fight," I replied, my voice cold. "I'm asking for justice. We'll file for divorce on grounds of cruelty and constructive abandonment," James said, making notes on a legal pad. "We'll also file a civil suit for emotional distress. The threat is useful. We can use it to show a pattern of intimidation. But our strongest weapon would be a witness. Someone who can corroborate the atmosphere in that house." Jake leaned forward. "I heard them, James. On Christmas Eve, when I was doing traffic control near their neighborhood, I took a walk down their street. I heard the yelling, the insults. I saw Ms. Rose carry Emily out. I recorded some of it on my phone before I identified myself." James's eyebrows shot up. "You recorded it?" "Just audio. It was a chaotic situation. I was concerned for their safety. That's potentially problematic, given consent laws, but it's also dynamite." James turned to me. "Jake's testimony will be crucial. A police officer, your former student, an impartial witness. It counters their narrative that you're just a meddling, hysterical mother." The word hysterical stung, but I knew he was right. That was exactly how they would paint me. As we left the office, Jake placed a hand on my arm. "I'm all in, Ms. Rose. Whatever you need." "Thank you, Jake. For everything." He gave me a grim smile. "You taught me to always stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. I'm just following my coach's lead." Back at the apartment, a small miracle was occurring. Emily was in the kitchen. She wasn't cooking, but she was standing at the counter, slowly turning the pages of one of the cookbooks Jake had brought. It was the first spark of interest I had seen in her since Christmas Eve. "See anything you like?" I asked softly, not wanting to startle her. She pointed a trembling finger at a picture of a rustic apple pie, the crust golden and flaky. "We used to make this," she whispered. "Remember? You'd let me sprinkle the cinnamon sugar." "I remember," I said, my heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and hope. "We can make it again, whenever you're ready." She didn't reply, but she didn't close the book either. She just kept looking at the picture, as if trying to remember the person who used to enjoy such simple pleasures. The legal machinery began to grind. James filed the papers. The Whitlocks, as expected, responded with a blizzard of countermotions and denials. They hired a high-powered, notoriously ruthless law firm. Their narrative, as outlined in their response, was a masterpiece of distortion. They painted Emily as emotionally unstable, lazy, and manipulative, a woman who had driven a wedge between herself and her loving, patient husband and his supportive family. I was portrayed as an overbearing, absentee mother who was now trying to destroy her daughter's marriage out of spite. The battle lines were drawn, and the battlefield would be the Boise County Courthouse. The weeks leading up to the trial were a special kind of torture. The anonymous threats stopped, replaced by a more insidious pressure. A friend of Evelyn's approached me at the grocery store, suggesting it would be better for everyone if Emily just came home and stopped this nonsense. I saw Harold once, across the street from the courthouse during a preliminary hearing. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me, his expression cold and dismissive, before turning and walking away. The message was clear: I was beneath his notice, a gnat to be swatted away. Emily, meanwhile, was a ghost in our own home. The medication from Dr. Carter helped stabilize her mood, but the light in her eyes was still dim. The prospect of the trial terrified her. She had nightmares where she was back on the porch, freezing, while faceless figures laughed at her from behind a bright window. One evening, Jake came over for dinner. I had made a simple pasta, and the three of us ate in a silence that was heavy but not uncomfortable. Afterward, as I was washing dishes, I watched them from the kitchen. Jake was showing Emily something on his phone, his voice low and gentle. She was listening, her head tilted, and for a fleeting second, I saw the ghost of a smile touch her lips. It was in that moment that I saw it, the way Jake looked at her. It wasn't just pity or duty. It was a deep, protective fondness. And I saw the way Emily, for the first time in years, didn't seem to shrink under a man's gaze. Later, as the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Emily sat on the couch across from Jake. She was twisting the hem of her sweater, her knuckles white. "Jake," she began, her voice so quiet I had to stop washing the dishes to hear. "There's something you should know. I might never be able to have children. The doctors said, after everything, it's very unlikely." She took a shuddering breath, as if bracing for rejection. "If that disappoints you." I held my breath, the dishcloth frozen in my hand. Jake didn't hesitate. He leaned forward, took her fidgeting hands in his, and looked directly into her eyes. "Emily Larson," he said, his voice firm and sure. "I don't need that. You are already my family." The simplicity and sincerity of his words hung in the air. Emily's composure broke. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. She didn't sob, she just let them fall, a silent release of a burden she had carried for so long. I turned away, tears streaming down my own face, my heart so full of gratitude for this good man that it felt like it might burst. For the first time since I'd found her on that porch, a genuine, unshakable hope began to bloom within me. No matter what happened in that courtroom, Emily was going to be okay. She was finding her way back to herself, and she wasn't alone. But the trial loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon. The Whitlocks had power, influence, and a complete lack of shame. They were ready for a fight. And so was I. The morning of the first day of the trial dawned cold and gray, the sky a sheet of unbroken iron. I dressed with care in a simple, dark blue suit, wanting to project an image of calm competence, not the raging mother they expected. Emily wore a gray dress that hung on her frame, her face pale and drawn. She held my hand as we walked into the courthouse, her grip so tight it was almost painful. The Whitlock family was already there, a united front of tailored suits and icy composure. Ryan looked polished and arrogant in a sharp gray suit, his lawyer whispering in his ear. Harold Whitlock sat beside him, his posture erect, his gaze sweeping over the room with the bored authority of a man who had presided over hundreds of such dramas. Evelyn and Abigail were a vision of coordinated elegance, their expressions a mixture of disdain and feigned sorrow. They didn't look like abusers. They looked like pillars of the community. And I knew, with a sinking heart, that this was their greatest weapon. Jake was there, sitting in the spectators section in his full police uniform. His presence was a silent challenge, a blue line between us and them. He met my gaze and gave a firm, almost imperceptible nod. We took our seats at the plaintiff's table. James Miller gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Remember, stay calm. No matter what they say. The judge entered, the Honorable George Peterson, a man with a reputation for being no-nonsense and, according to James, notoriously resistant to emotional arguments. My stomach tightened. James laid out our case methodically. He presented the bank statements, illustrating the financial support I'd provided, which had been funneled into the Whitlocks' lifestyle. He entered Emily's medical records into evidence, the cold, clinical language describing her severe depression and PTSD. Our client has endured not only the profound grief of multiple miscarriages, James said, his voice resonating in the quiet room, but also a sustained campaign of psychological abuse designed to make her believe she was worthless. She was isolated, demeaned, and on the night in question, literally cast out into the cold while her husband and his family celebrated without a care. It was then that the Whitlocks' lead counsel, a slick, silver-haired man named Robert Thorne, stood for his cross-examination. He didn't address the facts. He attacked Emily's character. Is it not true, Mrs. Larson, that you have a history of emotional instability? He began, his tone syrupy with false concern. Emily flinched. I was sad. After I lost the babies. Sad. Thorne repeated, making the word sound trivial. Or did you use these episodes to avoid your responsibilities as a wife? To avoid cooking, cleaning, contributing to your household? That's not true, Emily whispered. Let the record show the witness's voice is barely audible, Thorne said smugly. He then called his first witness, Martha, the Whitlocks' former housekeeper. The woman, looking nervous and avoiding our eyes, took the stand. Under Thorne's prompting, she painted a picture of Emily as a recluse. She'd lock herself in her room all day, Martha said, her voice shaky. I had to do everything. The cooking, the cleaning. She never lifted a finger. I shot to my feet, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. That's a lie. Emily loved that house. She cooked every meal. The judge slammed his gavel. Ms. Rose. You will control yourself or I will have you removed. I sat down, my face burning, my hands clenched into fists in my lap. I looked at Harold Whitlock. He was watching me, a faint, smug smile on his lips. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the judge. A chill that had nothing to do with the courtroom's air conditioning ran down my spine. The fix was in. Then James stood for our rebuttal. Your Honor, we would like to present a key piece of evidence. A recording from the evening of December 24th, which captures the defendants in their own words, revealing their true attitudes toward the plaintiff. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Robert Thorne was on his feet instantly. Objection, Your Honor. This recording was made surreptitiously, without the consent of the parties. It is a clear violation of Idaho's privacy statutes and is therefore inadmissible. The judge didn't even hesitate. Sustained. The recording will not be entered into evidence. It felt like a physical blow. The air rushed from my lungs. I looked at James, whose face was a mask of frustrated fury. I glanced at Jake. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. The one piece of irrefutable proof, the sound of their cruelty, was tossed aside on a legal technicality. The trial dragged on for a week. It was a brutal, demoralizing spectacle. The Whitlocks' lawyers twisted every fact, poisoned every memory. Ryan took the stand and, with breathtaking gall, claimed that he had begged Emily to come inside, that her sitting on the porch was a dramatic stunt. He spoke of her failures as a wife with a chilling detachment. Through it all, Emily sat beside me, growing smaller and paler with each passing day. She was being publicly flayed, her most painful wounds opened and mocked for all to see. On the final day, during closing arguments, Robert Thorne gestured toward our table. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, what we have here is a tragic case of a woman who is deeply unwell, being manipulated by a mother who refuses to let her daughter grow up. The Whitlocks are a proud, upstanding family who have done nothing but try to help a woman who could not, or would not, help herself." When he finished, the silence in the room was absolute. We had lost. I knew it with every fiber of my being. The judge returned with the verdict after a shockingly short deliberation. "The court grants the divorce request," he began, and a tiny flicker of hope sparked in my chest. But it was extinguished almost immediately. However, the claims of domestic abuse are not substantiated by the evidence presented. Regarding the division of marital assets, the court finds that Mr. Whitlock was the primary financial contributor to the marriage. Therefore, the majority of the shared property is awarded to him. The words were a death knell. Not substantiated. The porch, the cold, the insults, the medical reports, none of it was enough. Harold Whitlock's influence had reached into this very chamber and strangled the truth. I couldn't contain it any longer. I stood, my voice raw and broken. "This is so unfair. This isn't justice." The judge's gavel came down like a gunshot. "Order." Ryan sauntered over, a victor claiming his spoils. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear, his voice a venomous whisper. "See, Rose? I told you, don't fight me. You're just a useless old woman." The world turned red. Every lesson in control, every tenet of my discipline, evaporated. My body coiled, my fist clenched, every muscle screaming to launch forward and wipe that smug smile off his face forever. But Jake was faster. He was in front of me in an instant, his own body a wall of tension, his fist raised, his eyes blazing with a fury that mirrored my own. The air crackled with the promise of violence. "Go ahead, hit me," Ryan taunted, his eyes gleaming. "I'll make sure you lose your badge. Who do you think you are? Just a low-life cop." Jake trembled on the edge, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I saw the struggle in his eyes, the war between his duty and his rage. And then, a broken sound. "No." Emily broke free from her stunned silence. She rushed forward, throwing herself between them, clinging to Jake's raised arm. "Please, Don't. I don't want you or Mom to become violent like him. I just want peace. I just want to keep living." Her desperate cry echoed in the stunned silence. It was a sound of such pure, unvarnished pain that it cut through the anger like a laser. Jake froze. The fire in his eyes died, replaced by a pained understanding. His fist slowly unclenched, dropping to his side. He bowed his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Camera phones flashed, capturing the scene, the triumphant Ryan, the protective Jake, and my broken daughter, begging for peace in the ruins of her life. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly. "This court is adjourned. Clear the room." The Whitlock swept out, a parade of cold satisfaction. Ryan flashed me one last, mocking smile over his shoulder before disappearing through the doors. I stood there, holding a sobbing Emily, Jake standing silently beside us, the three of us united in our shared defeat. The system had failed us. The power of the Whitlocks had proven too great. But as I looked at my daughter, at the tiny, defiant spark that had made her stand up and plead for peace instead of violence, I knew something with absolute certainty. This was not the end. The aftermath of the trial was a quiet, bitter pill. The official ruling was a victory for the Whitlocks, but the court of public opinion began to turn. The video of Emily's desperate plea in the courtroom went viral in our local community. The image of her fragile figure clinging to Jake's arm, contrasted with Ryan's arrogant smirk, was a powerful, damning narrative. Newspapers ran op-eds questioning the judgment. Social media buzzed with outrage. "Justice for Emily" slogans began to appear. The Whitlocks, for all their legal maneuvering, could not control the whispers that now followed them at the country club or the grocery store. Harold's legacy was tarnished, his backroom dealings the subject of hushed speculation. Ryan, the lawyer of injustice, found his reputation stained, his practice suffering as a result. They had won the battle, but they were losing the war for their social standing. For us, the loss in court was, in a strange way, a liberation. The fight was over. The waiting, the dread, the public humiliation, it was done. We could finally begin to heal. I moved Emily permanently into my apartment. It became our sanctuary. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to reclaim pieces of herself. It started with small things. One morning, she made a pot of coffee. A few days later, she helped me fold the laundry. Then, one afternoon, I came home to find her in the kitchen, one of Jake's mother's cookbooks open on the counter, a bowl of apples beside it. She looked up at me, her eyes still shadowed, but with a new determination. I thought I'd try the pie. Tears sprang to my eyes. "Can I help?" She nodded slowly. "You can peel the apples." We worked in a comfortable silence, the rhythmic sound of the peeler and the scent of cinnamon filling the small kitchen. It was the most normal, the most hopeful moment we had shared in years. She was not the master chef she once was, her movements were hesitant, her confidence fragile. But she was trying. She was fighting her way back. Jake became a constant, steady presence. His feelings for Emily, and hers for him, grew quietly but surely, a tender plant nurtured in the aftermath of the storm. He never pushed, never demanded. He was just there. A friend, a support, a promise of a future that was not defined by past pain. One sunny Saturday in spring, we went for a walk in the park. The air was warm, the trees were budding, and the world was coming back to life. Emily walked between Jake and me, her hand tucked in the crook of my arm. For the first time, I saw her look at the world around her, at the children playing, the couple strolling, the flowers blooming, without a flinch of pain. There was a quiet acceptance in her gaze, a peace that had been hard-won. We sat on a bench by the fountain, watching the water dance in the sunlight. "Mom," Emily said softly, her head resting on my shoulder. "Thank you." "For what, sweetheart?" "For not giving up on me. For fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself." I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. "I will always fight for you, Emily. Always." I looked at Jake, who was smiling at us, his love for Emily shining plainly in his eyes. I knew then that the justice we had been denied in the courtroom had found us in other, more profound ways. We had found safety. We had found peace. We had found a love that was based on respect and kindness, not cruelty and control. The Whitlocks had tried to break my daughter, to convince her she was worthless. But they had failed. Emily was stronger than they knew. And so was I. The revenge I had once craved, the desire to see them humiliated and ruined, had faded. It was replaced by something more powerful, the quiet, unshakable satisfaction of a life rebuilt, of a spirit reclaimed. My daughter was healing. She was learning to laugh again. She was surrounded by love. And as I sat there on that park bench, with the warm sun on my face and my daughter safe in my arms, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that we had won the only war that truly mattered. We had won our future.